This presentation is delivered by the Stanford Center for Professional Development.
Thanks, Stacy. I'm sorry that we had a little bit of an issue there with the slides. Hi, my name is Bill Burnett. I'm the director of the design program at Stanford, and I want to talk to you about teams and how you transform them into high-performance, sort of innovative teams using the methods that we talk about at Stanford that we call design thinking. So a couple of, maybe start with a few definitions. What's a team? Well, it's really just, you all work on teams, I'm sure, in your organizations. Teams are just collections of people formed around some kind of an organizational task. It may be a task force to look at improving productivity. It may be a team related to a project or a product that you're developing. But I'd like you to also think about teams in a different way. I want you to think about teams as a collection of behaviors and norms. Teams are, as I said, just a collection of people, and people have a certain expectation of how they should behave when they come to work, when they're on this team, and those normative behaviors are really what we're going to talk about transforming when we talk about moving teams from a less innovative to a more innovative stance. And so our premise is that if you want to transform your teams, you need to change behaviors. And, let's take a very simple behavior change sort of idea. Let's say it's only February and your New Year's resolution was that you want to diet this year. You want to lose some weight. Well, you can read books about losing weight. It doesn't actually do much. It's just sort of a cognitive thing. You can think about losing weight. Again, that doesn't necessarily cause the pounds to go away. What you actually need to do to lose weight is to change your behavior, right? You need to substitute an old behavior, having a donut every morning for breakfast, with a new behavior. Maybe just having, a bowl of low-fat oatmeal or yogurt. So once you can't, the premise in psychology is you can't change behavior cognitively, you change behavior by substitution. So the two things we're going to ask you to look at in terms of changing your teams into high-performance innovation teams is the two behaviors around brainstorming, some new behaviors around brainstorming, and also about changing space. And I'll explain space. It's a kind of an interesting issue in itself when we get there. So you're going to substitute old behaviors, new behaviors for old, and the best way to change behavior, particularly if you're the manager of these teams, is by modeling. You act the way you want others to act, and they will model after you. And by the way, this takes a little bit of patience because it takes about 8 weeks, according to the cognitive psychologists, for a behavior to become a habit in an individual. That's an interesting number. If you start, if you started dieting in January, you still haven't reached 8 weeks yet. So whatever you're doing it's still an effort to substitute the new behavior for the old. It's not become a habit. And since teams are collections of people, you're not going to embed these new behaviors in your team in anything less than about 2 months. It's probably going to take 3 or 4. So one of the things we notice when people come to the D School, they take an innovation class or they take a boot camp, and then they go back to their organizations. They have some change in their behavior, but after a while it seems to peter out, and it's really an issue of getting to that 8-week threshold. So it takes about 8 weeks for new behavior to become a habit. Another definition, what's this design thinking thing? Well, it started at Stanford. David Kelly, who's the founder of IDEO, probably one of the world's premier innovation, product development, and innovation organizations. He also founded our new institute, the D School, where we're teaching design thinking to everyone on the Stanford campus and to leaders in the industry. His quote is, "We believe the next generation of innovators and leaders need to be great design thinkers." So what is this design thinking thing? Well, it's really a different approach to problem solving. It's very dynamic, and it works particularly well in what's called an unbounded or poorly bounded problems. Most of the issues we deal with in business today are this class of problem. Competitors are changing too rapidly to really, model or understand. Strategies fail often because the outside conditions are changing so rapidly that the strategic Planning process is too slow. We utilize, in order to solve that, we utilize a lot of iteration, and we use a lot of prototyping to ask questions for rapid learning and improvement. We have a sort of fail early to succeed quickly strategy. And we use a lot of different methods for generating alternative ideas so that we can increase the number of innovation opportunities we have, which we believe creates the opportunity to have more innovative outcomes. We're going to talk about one of those alternative generation techniques, brainstorming, in some detail in this webinar. But the real key, I think, in design thinking is many people look at the problem-solving modes that we use, ideation, brainstorming, morphological analysis, prototyping, and think that's the key. The true key is actually that it's a different approach to problem finding. What we find in the people that we work with, both in the academic setting and the business setting, is that often, for a lot of good reasons, people are working on the wrong problem. They're working on a problem that's more of a symptom or an adjacent problem, and if they the highest leverage we find is in backing up and reframing what is the problem you're trying to solve. And we do that by using ethnography and empathy and observation of the actual solution space itself, of the people in their environment who have the problem, to redefine what we call a point of view. And we use prototyping and other methods to sort of reveal those latent needs and make sure that we're actually working on the right problem. So it's both a problem-solving but a problem-finding approach that I think makes this so powerful. And, of course, it's a new perspective on value creation because it's human-centered and sort of a co-creation process which focuses on real user needs. We have a process diagram. I'm always cautious when I put this up because it looks like it's sort of a linear thing. We start with empathy and we end with test. Really, it's a circular process, and you can enter the process at any point. You can have a technology that you're looking for a need. You can have a need that you're looking for, a problem to solve. But we basically, we like to break this down so that it can be taught. We start with empathy, which is where the need finding and ethnography occurs. We do a definition or point of view exercise, which is where the redefining of the problem comes in. Ideation, which contains all the ways of having lots and lots of ideas. We believe if you have a lot of ideas to choose from, you will choose better. We prototype, and then we test, and then we come back around to the definition, the point of view, and see if something that we've learned in the process of interrogating this poorly bounded problem through prototyping changes our point of view, and it often does. And then through that process, we sort of zoom in, co-creating solutions. And this has turned out to work in things from product development to service development to designing new experiences. Sometimes people aren't sure what I mean when I talk about experience design. Think of Disneyland, probably the best designed experience on the planet, from the moment you hit the parking lot to entering the park to the day that you have in any of the Disney properties. You're inside a completely designed experience, and every touch point has been considered. So that's design thinking, sort of defined, and a process diagram. And also the notion of behavior change as the way that we're going to approach changing teams and team dynamics to move them towards more of an innovative basis. And one of the things that we teach a lot and work a lot on and have developed some new thinking on is brainstorming. And I'm sure everybody that's out in webinar land here has done a brainstorm. If I could have put a poll slide in, I would have asked you, but I'll bet you 100% of you have been to something called a brainstorming session or a brainstorm. My guess is if I had been observing what you were doing, it might not have been fully, it might not fully meet the criteria that I have for brainstorming, because part of what I look at in research is, how do we actually create more creative students here and executives in our seminars, and brainstorming is a key tool. And just recently, I'm not sure how many people saw this, but in the New Yorker, in the January 30th, New Yorker just came out last week. There was an article by a writer, Jonah Lehrer, who has picked up a bunch of research, and this research has been around since the 50s and 60s and 70s, And his, the title is sort of, to generate some buzz, as journalists will do. The title of his article was that brainstorming doesn't work. And in that, he cites some research that says that brainstorming is actually inefficient. I mean, one of the notions that most people have about brainstorming is that you would come to a session, you'd have lots and lots of ideas, and that somehow that the group of people could generate more and better ideas than people working alone. But in a number of studies, and particularly the original work on this was done at Yale, it has been shown that people have twice as many ideas, if you just simply count the number of ideas they write down on a page, working alone as they do in brainstorming sessions. So that's interesting, because I think most people would think brainstorming generates more ideas. But the research shows, and it's been repeated, and we have no doubt that this is true, that people will have more ideas working alone than in groups. Now, if you look at this, if you look at the research specifically, the brainstorming that has been done in these groups has been done with people that I would quantify as novices. Novice meaning, and I'll define these categories in the next slide, but novices meaning people who essentially have less than 100 hours of experience with anything. Typically in the studies, a group of people are brought together. They're taught the brainstorming rules, defer judgment, go for volume, have wild ideas. Those are the basic rules. We have other rules like one idea at a time, be visual, things like that. But they're taught the rules, and then they're set to brainstorm on a topic that the researchers have created. So one thing to notice is that they have, this is the first time, or maybe the first few times they've ever done this in a structured format. And then the figure of merit, the thing the researcher is trying to measure, is captured at the end of each session. So at the end of the session, I take all the pages off the wall of all the notes or Post-its that have been placed up, and I maybe measure the number of ideas. Or in some cases, they've measured the diversity of ideas, how many ideas are off the central topic, and trying to measure how wild the ideas are. But it's always captured right at the end of the session. So, although I completely agree, and I think it seems obvious, I'm not quite sure how you can get a PhD doing such obvious research, but people get them, I guess, that I can write things down faster than I can talk. And particularly if I have to wait for other people to speak in a brainstorming session or a brainstorming modality, we will not generate the same number of ideas as we could if I just sat by myself in a room and wrote down every idea I could write as fast as I would. But I want to dig a little bit deeper, and I want to introduce an analogy that I use and that we teach here. And I want you to think a little bit about jazz. I don't know how many people out there like jazz or maybe play jazz or listen to it. But jazz is an interesting art form. One is probably the one true American art form. It was born in America and has traveled all over the world, but it is absolutely an American invention. And jazz is the one form of music that when musicians sit down to play a piece, to play a song, they expect to play it differently than they've ever played it before. They expect to improvise. Now they have a structure, they have the song, and they have a chart which lists the chord changes and the melody. But there will be parts of the chart that say, 16 bars improvise, 8 bars improvise. So they aren't told what to play. They're simply told what the song is. And it's truly one of these interesting mind-body problems, right? I'm a saxophone player, and I know how to move my fingers to make the keys, the notes come out of the saxophone. So that's something I have to have practiced and been good at. But and I'm following the song along, so I have a cognitive mode going in my mind. But at some point, the band leader will turn to me and say, go, and now I have to create something that literally I've never heard before. It's not written down for me, and I need to invent it completely out of my mind. So how does that work? Stanley Crouch, who's a jazz critic, a MacArthur Genius Grant Award winner. He programs art jazz for the Lincoln Center. Wrote this in a Forbes article a while back, and I love it because I think it's true then, and it's even more true now as we've 10, 15 years later. He said, jazz is the one art form that's resolved the so-called mind-body problem. Right? Jazz players playing in the moment and creating music they've never heard before, literally, inside the structure of a song, are, I think, just like brainstormers, inside the structure of a problem, trying to create solutions that they don't know they know, right? And he said further, in the digital age, our organizations and our careers will become more and more closely aligned with the jazz ensemble. We'll find ourselves improvising with greater and greater confidence and fearing less and less the imaginative powers of the individual. How many of you, in your organizations today have seen this shift in the last 10 or 15 years? We talked about it in education a lot. We're just educating students to know the answer isn't going to be enough. We need to educate for creativity. We need to educate for sort of multidisciplinary interests. We need to educate people to look at systems and synthesis rather than just analysis. If we can't put information in context and make it valuable and real, we're not doing what we need to do to educate this next generation of technologists and leaders. And Crouch was saying this back in '96 that because we live in a sort of post-information age, our jobs and the way we work will become more and more like a jazz ensemble. And I love this analogy because I think it's absolutely true. A jazz ensemble is just like a brainstorming group. And so if I was a psychologist and I was trying to see what is the capability of a brainstorming group, I might go get the Miles Davis Sextet, Bill Evans, one of the greatest jazz piano players in the world, Jimmy Cobb, Paul Chambers, Cannonball Adderley, and John Coltrane. John Coltrane, for goodness sakes, on saxophone. That's the sextet that created the album Kind of Blue, which is the best-selling jazz album of all time. It's quadruple platinum, certified sales. And you wouldn't expect to sit in as an amateur who maybe just learned the saxophone and can play a few notes, maybe read a little music. You wouldn't expect to sit in with the Miles Davis Sextet and create great jazz, because you have to practice. And when you practice anything, brainstorming, a musical instrument, anything, any technical skill, at first the mechanics are the difficulty. How do I think in the moment? How do I ping pong ideas off of each? How do I listen to another and have an idea? How do I free associate and not get stuck? These are difficult mechanics. And then even after you get good at that, you could be really good at playing scales and playing brainstorming games. Perfect mechanics do not make perfect improvisation. Improvisation is a completely different skill. And it's partly a 10,000-hour problem. Now, there are some psychologists who believe that in 10,000 hours anyone can become an expert. There are others who believe that may be a simplification. But we look at chess masters, we look at golfers, we look at and other athletes. There seems to be a threshold around 10,000 hours that creates expertise, which in fact is mastery. It's mastered the sport, so that things that are mechanical have become habitual. They're relegated to either muscle memory or unconscious competence, and people move into this mastery level where they can do things that no one else can do. But it takes about 100 hours to move from a novice to any sort of competency. 100 hours, it's only a couple of 3 weeks, but of hard work, and we talk about moving from I can't play the saxophone to I actually can I can play a scale, I can make notes. I could probably get to there in 3 or 4 weeks of practice, but it takes a good 1,000 hours to go from competency to any sort of expertise, and 10,000 hours to go to mastery. So in the same way that you would not expect to sit in with the Miles Davis Sextet and be able to hold your own with those musicians who have practiced maybe hundreds of thousands of hours to get to the effortless mastery that they have as jazz players, why would you think that mastering the discipline of sort of letting go and innovating in the moment would take any less time than that? This is not easy stuff to do. Accessing massively parallel unconscious processing, accessing visual information in your brain, and being able to synthesize the information of the group on the fly in the moment takes a lot of practice. So when I see when I see psychologists saying brainstorming doesn't work, what I actually hear them saying is beginning saxophone players can't play jazz. I believe that's true, but I think when you have competent players, players who put in 100 hours or so, brainstorming can be effective, and you want to measure more than just what happened at the session. Because as you've probably known, I design innovation sessions, brainstorming sessions, idea sessions, whatever you want to call them. That's a moment in time, and then people leave the meeting. And how many of you have had the experience of the next morning, after that really good brainstorming session you had at the office, but nothing seemed to come out of it? The next morning you're standing in the shower and suddenly you have a good idea. That piece of strategy that you were looking for suddenly comes to you, or that product notion, or the way you want to position something, or that new channel idea suddenly comes to you, right? That's another thing, by the way, a guy named Herbert Benson at Harvard has studied. He's a physician. He wrote a book called The Relaxation Response. You can take a look at that. I'm not going to speak to that specifically, but there is a biological model for why you have ideas 12 to 24 hours after a brainstorming session or a session where you load your unconscious thinking with the problem. So you want to look at things that are beyond the session itself, because often after the session, 12 to 24 hours later, new ideas emerge which were stimulated by the brainstorm. And another thing that happens is that new group norms are modeled. If you have an organization that doesn't have any kind of normative practice like brainstorming or innovation sessions or whatever you want to call it, then you really should not expect that group to have creative behaviors. The creative behaviors would be anomalies. They would be things that people did in spite of the norms. But if you have regular creativity sessions, brainstorming sessions, you're modeling a norm that one of the things we do at work is we have ideas. Once you've got that as a group norm behavior, and you're tracking ideas that happen post-session, I think you'll find that brainstorming works on a bunch of different levels, and it's not simply the number of ideas we counted at the end of the session. But there are two other little technical things that I want to point out, because they always annoy me when people say they do brainstorming and they don't do these two things. They don't prepare or warm up, and they have really bad selection criteria. I was once doing a 3-day innovation session, which was essentially 3 days of brainstorming, for a major American consumer goods manufacturer. Won't mention who they were. We generated, hundreds and hundreds of ideas that were really kind of groundbreaking ideas for this product category. And it's a pretty stagnant, low involvement product category. We also selected the ideas that we thought would be the most game-changing for the organization. But at the end of the session, they basically selected ideas that would have been, that we could have, predicted they would have done. They selected a series of sort of line extensions as their outcomes. Introduced those products, got sort of line extension results, and then kind of claimed that the brainstorming session didn't work. So you have to be careful about how you pick what you do. Just really simply, you got to warm up, because you just came from a budget meeting, you just came from a meeting where you're doing an org chart, you just came from something else where you're completely in your left brain. You're in your analytic and rational thinking mode. We want to get you to a synthesis mode. Everybody doesn't have to, sit in a full lotus, but we do want you to be thinking a different way. So we have to transition your thinking from analysis to synthesis, from left brain to right brain. We typically do this with a bunch of warm-up exercises. You can play Pictionary, which is a nice visual game. Probably everybody knows that game where you sort of try to guess what someone's drawing. You can play other games. We have a bunch of exercises we've lifted from improvisational theater, which get people moving and thinking and reacting in the moment. But if you don't do this transition, don't expect a person whose mind is on their email and their budget to suddenly create beautiful music with you in your brainstorm. It's not going to happen. So you have to warm up. And idea selection is critical. If you take all these crazy, wonderful ideas from your brainstorm and you run them through the filter of what's feasible, you will get incremental and feasible results. You'll get things you probably could have gotten without going to the brainstorm. So that really wasn't particularly useful. What we suggest instead is that you select for potential, not feasibility. We believe that your organization is good, and it can take a high potential idea and make it feasible. But if you select for potential, you're going to get a completely different set of ideas. And the way we do it is voting. Now, brainstorming is a group behavior. You want everybody to participate, and you want them to be influencing and leapfrogging off of each other's ideas. We do voting a completely different way. We're now in the evaluative mode. This is the last phase of the brainstorming session. Don't forget this. And this comes from our boot camp at the D School. You vote silently. We give everybody a bunch of different colored stickers, and we say, go vote for your 2 ideas that you think are most likely to succeed, 2 ideas that would be most likely to delight, and without regard for any constraints on that, and 2 ideas that would be the most breakthrough if we could ignore, whatever the fatal flaws. We don't have enough money to do this. We don't have enough time to do this. This requires, reversing the laws of gravity. Whatever that is. You let people vote, and they vote silently without influencing each other. And then you take those ideas, and then the next step after the brainstorm is to process those into an action item list. How could we, realize this potential? When you do that, you get a very different sort from the brainstorm, and you'll find that the results are much more valuable to your organization, much more actionable. Okay, I want to, just wrap it up and say brainstorming can transform the way your teams behave. This data shows that novices with poor setup and follow-through, probably brainstorm poorly. I would argue that even with novices, you have to practice. And practicing brainstorming will still set the expectation that one of the things we do when we come to the work is we ask you to be creative. We ask you to act like a creative person. Just fake it. Even if you don't feel creative, act like one. And then I want to leave you with the notion that good brainstorming is like great jazz. You need to be expert enough to create in the moment, but to improve your output, you want to warm up and then select ideas for potential, not feasibility. The last thing I want to talk to you about is space. People often come to the master class we're going to do in June or one of the boot camps that we run, and afterwards they say, okay, give me one thing I could take back to my organization that will work, because I really want to change my teams. I want to make them more innovative. And I tell them, change your space. So space creates behavior. This is a well-known, psychological system. If you look at this space, which is a classic classroom, we have hundreds of these at Stanford. The seats are all facing a stage. The stage is elevated from the seats. The seats are bolted to the floor so they can't move. They all face one direction. There's a little, podium on the stage. Obviously, a professor is going to get up there and lecture. And when you walk into a space like this, you know what you're expected to do. You're expected to sit down, take notes, perhaps ask a few questions. But the difference between you and the professor is clear, and the organization of the room leaves you almost no flexibility. So it's really clear what kind of behavior you will do in this space. Here's another space. I actually took this picture yesterday. This is up in one of the D School classrooms for the class called Entrepreneurial Design for Extreme Affordability. A great class. We send people to Africa, and we're working on interesting, hard problems in poverty and water and other things in the third world. When you walk into this room, the first thing you notice is it's kind of chaotic. The second thing you notice is there's Post-its and visual stuff all over the place on the walls and the floor and the ceiling. There is no stage. There's no clear hierarchy, not clear where the front of the room or the back of the room is. If you look carefully at the pictures, you'll notice that all of the tables are on wheels. All of the whiteboards, the vertical whiteboards are also on wheels. You can't really see it, but some of the other, furniture and stuff in the back, there's carts and things. They're all on wheels. So if I were to take a picture of this space in another, tomorrow or the next day, it wouldn't look anything like this. So what sort of behavior do you expect in a space like this? Well, you really don't know. We've never probably been in something like this before, certainly not as a graduate student. And so that allows us to do a couple things. It sort of changes the set, because you're not sure how you're supposed to act. Then as you come into the space and the professors and teaching assistants greet you, they teach you new norms of behavior, which include lots of brainstorming, lots of group interaction. You'll also notice that if I took a picture of this space when it was full of people, you'd probably be hard-pressed to tell who were the professors and who were the students. There's no visible signs that create status markers for you, right? So in that same New Yorker article, the author does mention another study which demonstrates, because he was asked, well, what does work? And what works is proximity and raw in space. A Harvard study of over 36,000 scientific papers that were ranked important, innovative papers in their fields. And the researcher did an interesting thing. He just looked at where the first, second, third author were, literally, where were they sitting when they wrote the paper? Were they 3 meters apart, 10 meters apart, 100 meters apart, a kilometer apart, at different parts of the world apart? And what was the environment they were writing the paper in? And the two most significant pieces of data that rated highly significant, was that inventors or innovators who were near each other, within 3 meters, wrote more innovative papers than inventors that were separated, and that people who were in what he characterized as raw, unfinished, or easily modified environments did more significant and more innovative work. And there's a famous Building 20 at MIT. It's mentioned in the studies, and there's some other stuff that has been written about it. So it was a building that was just thrown up right after World War II as a sort of temporary place to put some extra researchers where they didn't have room. And then MIT sort of forgot about it, and it was sort of an unfinished building, but it lasted for 30 years, and almost all of the groundbreaking research that came out of MIT in computers, computer interface, chips, technology, and other things came out of Building 20. And when they talked to people about it, it was because people loved the building. They literally, if you didn't have room for a piece of instrumentation, you just cut a hole in the wall and stuck it through the wall. So people felt like they sort of owned the space, and the number of different groups that got put in there, because they were just folks that were left over from, didn't have room in the nice buildings, and who got to talk to each other and cross-pollinate, turned out to be one of the most significant factors for innovation. So drawing on that information, that study, that's how we designed the D School. And if you want to, so we promote co-location, we promote multidisciplinary collisions, and we make a space that is really sort of authorable by the students. If you want to do the same thing, the simplest thing, you find a conference room. It doesn't matter. The uglier the better. Pick the one with no windows, because nobody wants to be in there anyway, and create what we call a war room. War rooms have a couple of consistent features. They have persistent information. The stuff you've been brainstorming, the stuff you've been thinking about, the stuff from the last status meeting, the budgets, they're up on the walls. They're visual, they're visible, and they don't come down. You want to remove status clues. Status creates hierarchy, and inside hierarchies, we know we have to wait for the person above us to have an opinion before we do. So it defeats creativity. So you want to get rid of all status clues and make the space a space that when people walk in, doesn't matter if you're senior vice president or the mail boy, you're the same. D-School classrooms have no visible hierarchy, and this defeats that sage on stage, that guy in the front of the room who's lecturing and you're taking notes. We do it on purpose to remove the difference between us and the students, and it's very, very powerful in creating innovation. They always make the room what we call self-authoring. Right? That's why everything in our room is on wheels. I will sometimes walk into a D-School classroom expecting to give a 20-minute kickoff lecture, and the students will say, we don't want a lecture right now. we're working in our teams. And they will have already formed team rooms in the room by moving whiteboards around and moving some tables around, and they'll be working. So put everything on wheels and make sure that everything can be hacked. Hackable space, that nothing is precious, that people can change stuff. This will, by the way, drive your facilities people crazy. Just tell them this room is off limits. Don't go in there. It's kind of like my teenage son's bedroom. I don't go in there. I don't want to see what's going on in there. It's a mess all the time. But when you can hack the space, self-author it, the information is persistent, and it's a space that lowers, that evens out the hierarchy, you will find that you've created a room that demands a different kind of behavior. So if you want references on more of this, two of the people who are responsible for the D-School space have just published a book called Make Space, How to Set Up the Stage for Creative Collaboration. It's a great book, just came out, and you can get Scott Darley and Scott Wittoff are the authors, and these slides will be available. You can pull that down if you're interested in learning more about how to create a war room or create other spaces in your organization that will increase innovation and create team formation and normative behaviors that are different. And the New Yorker article, which is actually online as a podcast. You can listen to it. You can read it from the January 30th New Yorker edition. It is online and available, I think, for free. The takeaways, again, changing your teams and transforming them into innovative teams. It's just about changing behaviors. You're not going to change the people. They're the same people. You're not going to change their personalities. That's fixed. But you can change what they expect to do when they come to work. The two most powerful methods we know of doing this is move to the Jazz brainstorming model and create a space that demands these new behaviors. The most important thing you can do as a manager is model that behavior. Be the creative person so that they know they have permission to act just like you. This is a little scary because you may not have permission to act that way from your manager, but that's where you show leadership and you model the behavior. You have to act differently, and oh, by the way, you have to reward differently. One of the things you have to reward for is, attempts. One of the things you have to reward for is failure. That may be an interesting thing in your organization, but if you can model the behavior you want and you act differently and reward differently, your teams will follow your lead. And remember to be patient. It takes about 8 weeks to establish a new habit. Thank you for your time. I'm going to turn it back to Stacy, who's going to tell you a little bit more about the things that, Anyway, I'm going to turn it back to the SCPD folks, and they're going to tell you about the master class that's coming up and a couple of other things.
Thank you, Bill. I'm Joyce Rice, the Director of Marketing for the Stanford Center for Professional Development, and I really appreciate your talk. As a member of multiple teams, I look forward to modeling some of these design thinking concepts when I get together with my teams again, and I guess maybe we need to call those jam sessions. Talking about jam sessions, we again would like very much to encourage you to consider the Innovation Masters Series program that would be held here at Stanford coming up in June. It is a very highly interactive enterprise. You will have an opportunity to meet a number of people from other organizations, and let me take it to kind of the next step here, that we've had several meetings now over a couple of years of this program, and we're delighted, for instance, that last year more than 70% of the participants actually came from international locations, so it's a marvelous opportunity to meet people and to exchange ideas with folks who also come from all sectors, private, public, nonprofit, and government entities. During this program, over the 3 days, have an opportunity to explore and experiment with many of the brainstorming and design thinking ideas that Bill was just talking about, and actually begin to work on problems, do things in a lot of different ways, carry through the whole design thinking process. And one of the things that many participants appreciate is that they do form relationships here and networking opportunities that extend beyond the meeting here at Stanford. One of the things that program participants really appreciate is that these faculty members from the design group at Stanford are highly engaged in the program, and you will have a chance to hear from them not only during a portion that they may be leading, but they are participate throughout the program and are exchanging ideas with each other as well as with the participants. So if you've had a chance to think a little bit about some of the ideas that were expressed and the notion of the Innovation Masters Series, we'd appreciate hearing from you here in a poll about the level of your interest in the Design Thinking course and the Innovation Masters Series. Okay, I think we'll close the poll. And we'll conclude at this point with, first of all, to thank you very much for joining us today. We hope that you will have an opportunity to come back. We will be hosting additional webinars on this particular topic, as well as other webinars that are hosted by the Stanford Center for Professional Development. And at this point, we would be happy to entertain some questions that you might have. We have a few minutes, and Bill Burnett will address those.
Okay, I got a couple of questions that I could probably address. One question is, what is ethnography? You know, in cultural anthropology or ethnographic studies, it's a series of techniques and tools. We use interviewing, we use observation, on-site observation. We use a couple of other sort of reportorial techniques to investigate a need. So if we were working, designing a new service, let's say for a bank or a financial institution, rather than try to get a bunch of smart people in a room and think of things we might do, we start by shadowing people using financial services at a bank, talking to what we call extreme users, people who never go online, don't trust an online, service system, people who use it exclusively to manage all of their financial information. So we would, we both interview and observe people having interactions with the services and having things that are negative or difficult interactions. And ethnography is just sort of the blanket term for the techniques of doing what we call need finding, trying to get at the tacit or the unspoken needs in any kind of problem, whether it be a design problem or a policy problem or a services problem. A couple of people have asked if I could repeat the reference to the New Yorker article. So this is in the New Yorker in the January 3rd edition. If you just go, January 30th, 30 edition. If you go online and either search Brainstorming doesn't work, New Yorker article, or some variation of that, I think you'll find the podcast. And again, the podcast is free. You can listen to the author be interviewed by the New Yorker staff on what this article says about research, both the research, he cites some references to the research on why it doesn't work with novices, and also why co-located spaces that are raw seem to create the best, most fertile grounds for innovation. Yeah, so another question is, can I recommend any other reference material on design thinking or for how you define good problems? Yeah, there's a couple of authors that I would point you to. Tim Brown, who's the current CEO and president of IDEO, I-D-E-O, the innovation consultancy, wrote a book on design and design thinking that I think would be a good starting point. So that's Tim Brown from IDEO. If you like a more business-focused approach, Roger Martin, who is the dean of the Rotman School of Management at Toronto University, who's widely quoted as saying it shouldn't be an MBA, a Master's of Business Administration, because we don't teach people to administer things. It should be an MBC, a Master of Business Creation, because that's what I want my students to know how to do. And he wrote a book called The Design of Business, and he talks about design thinking, but uses sort of a different model, a different terminology. I think that's a pretty interesting book to read if you're looking for something. And then one of our professors, Dev, D-E-V, Patnaik, P-A-T-N-A-I-K, wrote a book on empathy and need finding. He runs in addition to being a professor here, he runs a consulting firm called Jump Associates. And Dev's book on need finding is probably the best source for looking at how you use need finding, ethnography, and the techniques of sort of anthropology to discover the latent needs and frame those in a way that you can use for a design or an innovation activity. So the three authors, again, are Tim Brown, the CEO of IDEO, Dave Patnaik, the first name D-E-V, last name P-A-T-N-A-I-K, who's written probably the best book on empathy, and Roger Martin, who's the dean of the business school at Toronto, who wrote a book called The Design of Business. Those would be three resources I'd look at first. And, of course, they have some bibliographies in there of other books that are, fundamental to them. If you're looking for some, for the first book or the foundational book on brainstorming, brainstorming was allegedly invented, although I don't know if that's really true, maybe just invented and branded, by a guy named Alex Osborne back in the 50s. He was at a major New York City advertising firm, and he was the guy who first formalized the use of brainstorming to create creative ads. So Alex Osborne, who's written a number of books on the subject, would be probably the guy to go to as the source for brainstorming information. And then if you want to understand how to make yourself more creative and how to become a better brainstormer, you want to look at a book by James Adams. We often use this as a text for the Master's Series. James Adams is a professor emeritus here now, and his book was called Conceptual Blockbusting, A Guide to Better Ideas. So Jim Adams talks about both how creativity works and what blocks it. And he has sort of 4 categories of blocks and makes the claim that if you're aware of how you get blocked and how you can get over these stumbling blocks to creativity, you will be a much more creative contributor, both in brainstorming sessions and individually. Let's see. I've got one other question here. In order to turn novices into experts with brainstorming or other things, how do you get people to stop being judgmental without sounding judgmental and in turn poisoning the mood of the meeting? I think we talk about the rules of brainstorming, and in some ways it's an oxymoron. How can an event which is supposed to be creative and free and exploring in the moment have rules? Well, in the same way that we all agree as jazz musicians to play basically the same song, even though we're going to play it differently this time than we've played it before. And when it comes my turn to solo, I may decide to insert a different song inside my solo just as a reference to something else. But we still agree that there is going to be a structure, a beginning and an end, and a way in which we decide to pass the lead back and forth, right, and pass the solo back and forth. I think that's the reason we have rules in brainstorming. It depersonalizes the don't critique rule. When you're the facilitator of a brainstorm and you're trying to get people to not be critics, to not be judgmental, and particularly with early brainstorming sessions and people who are not familiar with it, they believe that their expertise is being called for in the meeting, and so if they hear of an idea that won't work, they feel it's their obligation to tell you that that idea won't work. So if they know, if the rules are posted, we typically put the rules all around the room so you can just sort of point to it and say, don't criticize. That can depersonalize, the message. But also I think it's important, to sort of orient people to the purpose of this process. It's not actually asking for their expert opinion. In fact, it's asking for their, for a sort of a nonlinear association of things that are not about their expertise, but simply about their being in the moment with the rest of the group. So you can do it with, I typically do it with humor, particularly with early brainstormers and people who like to criticize. We used to have a little bell, like one of those little, bells that you hit and that tells somebody, somebody's at the front desk, you hit the little bell. Hit the little bell because say you heard a critique and then it just keep moving. I try not to dwell on the person who's being judgmental too much, but just ping pong to the next person and let the ideas continue to flow. People who tend to stop the brainstorm with their judgment will be quickly overrun if there's a lot of energy in the room, and then they'll want to participate in that energy rather than continue to be the critic. And if you have somebody who is persistently critical or doesn't really understand the method, why the method of non-judgment is important, just remove them. They're a bad brainstormer. You can be a brilliant classical musician. You can be the best, you can be Yo-Yo Ma, the best cello player on the planet, and be a terrible improviser. You may need the structure, of Bach's Cello Concerto No. 1 in order to express yourself, but you must play every note exactly the way it's written. Your expression comes from the variation, the slight variation and intonation that you bring to the piece. But you may be a terrible improviser, right? That doesn't mean you're a bad cello player. It just means you're not in my brainstorming session. So, certain personalities will have more difficulty with this than others, but everybody can learn to behave this way if they're properly motivated. I think that's about as much time as we've got. I'm going to turn it back to Stacy to close.
Thank you, everyone. The webinar will be available within a week for download, on-demand download. If you are interested in downloading the slides, please click on the icon at the top of the toolbar. It is located in the icon with 3 papers stacked on top of each other. Thank you very much for your time. Have a wonderful day. Thank you.